Infertile Rancher bought a teenage girl from child labor. What happened next changed everything. In the sweltering heat of a dusty Texas afternoon in 1887, a silent auction unfolds. No tears, no pleas, just numbers and a girl, 14, sold for $50 to a man who never believed he'd be a father. But what if this wasn't just a transaction, but the beginning of redemption? This is the story of a rancher whose barren land and lonelier soul were changed forever by a child no one wanted. What began as labor turned into legacy. What started as silence became healing. And what seemed like a cruel twist of fate revealed itself to be the family none of them expected. But before the end, you'll witness defiance, danger, and a quiet kind of love that grows not from blood, but from choice. Stay until the final scene, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered, not shouted. Comment below which part of this story moved you the most. And if you find meaning in stories like these, don't. The sun hung heavy over Galveston, Texas, that day in 1887, blistering and blinding, as if even the sky had turned its back on what was about to unfold. Beneath the rusted iron roof of the auction barn, there were no cries, no bargains, just a hush thick with heat and shame. A line of children stood like livestock, each marked with a number. Most avoided eye contact. But one girl didn't. 14. Hair tangled, feet bare. Rebecca Sullivan. She didn't look afraid. She looked tired. Not in the way of someone who needed rest, but like someone who'd stopped expecting to be rescued. And when her name was called, she met the eyes of the man who placed the winning bid. What she offered him wasn't gratitude. It was pity. Samuel McKinnon hadn't come to save anyone. A childless rancher with soil as barren as his home, he only wanted help. But something in that girl's gaze, too old for her age, too knowing, made him pause. Not because he saw her pain, but because, for the first time in years, he felt seen. He didn't know it then, but what he had bought wasn't labor. It was the beginning of a new story. One that would challenge everything he thought he'd lost. One that would prove, sometimes all it takes to heal is someone finally seeing who you really are. The wagon wheels creaked beneath a heavy sky, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Rebecca sat on the edge of the wooden seat, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. Each mile of dusty trail blurred into the next. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask for anything. Girls like her had long since learned that questions often led to punishment, or worse, disappointment. When the wagon finally stopped, the house before her looked plain. Not poor, not proud, just lived in. The porch was uneven, the paint faded, but the windows were clean and open, like the house itself had nothing to hide. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. Something was cooking. Martha McKinnon stepped out to meet them. Her face was neither welcoming nor cold, just measured. She looked at Rebecca, not with curiosity or pity, but something quieter, like she was trying to remember a song from long ago. "You must be hungry," Martha said, brushing her hands on her apron. "What would you like for supper?" The question hung in the air like a foreign tongue. What would she like? No one had ever asked her that, not since her mother died, not in the years passed between houses, between hands, between names called and forgotten. Rebecca didn't answer, just nodded slightly, afraid to want anything. Inside, the house smelled of cornbread and stew, not extravagant but warm, familiar in a way she couldn't name. Martha didn't push. She simply set another place at the table, poured water into a chipped glass, and served her like she'd always been there. That night, Rebecca barely touched her food, but she watched everything. Samuel folded his napkin neatly when he finished eating. Martha buttered her bread with the back of a spoon instead of a knife. Even the dog by the hearth stretched before lying back down, like this was a home that didn't rush anything, not even its silence. No one told her what to do. No one locked the doors. The next morning she was up before the sun. Chickens needed feeding. The porch needed sweeping. She didn't wait to be asked. She just moved. She moved like someone afraid of stillness because stillness meant being noticed, and being noticed had never ended well. But here something strange happened. The more she worked, the less invisible she felt. She started memorizing patterns. When Martha liked to bake, how many logs Samuel used each night for the stove, how often the pantry needed restocking. Not because she was asked, but because something inside her wanted to be useful, to be needed, maybe even wanted. There were no chores listed, no tasks assigned, but every act of care she offered was met with something soft in return. A folded shawl left on her chair, a cup of tea poured without a word, an old pencil sharpened and set beside a blank page. She never called them anything, not sir or ma'am, certainly not mom or dad. Names were dangerous. Names meant claiming, and claiming always led to loss. Still, one evening Martha handed her a small book, the Farmer's Almanac. Rebecca traced the faded print like it held a secret. Martha just said, "Might help you learn the land, if you're staying a while." Rebecca nodded. She didn't say yes, but she didn't run either. Samuel noticed, too. One morning he watched as she adjusted the irrigation valve before he could. Said nothing but left his gloves beside hers on the fence post the next day. That was his way, and maybe that's what made it harder. No demands, no rules barked or punishments dealt, just space. Space to become someone. Rebecca wasn't sure what she was to them. Not daughter, not worker, maybe something in between. Like a note held just long enough between two chords, uncertain but no longer silent. She still flinched when doors closed too loudly. Still kept her bag half-packed just in case. But slowly, quietly, something inside her began to settle. Not like someone claiming land, more like someone being offered it. And for the first time in years, Rebecca began to imagine. What if this wasn't just a stop along the way? What if this was a beginning? The days passed like threads in a tapestry, quiet but purposeful. Rebecca moved through the ranch with the precision of someone who had once been punished for mistakes she didn't make, and so now avoided them altogether. She worked harder than necessary, spoke less than expected, and always kept her hands busy. Still, something about her effort didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like longing. One afternoon, while she was sweeping the back porch, Samuel stepped outside, holding a pencil and a scrap of paper. His hands, calloused from years of working the land, looked awkward holding such delicate tools. "You ever learn your letters?" he asked, not looking at her. Rebecca hesitated. "A little," she said quietly, brushing dust into the wind. He handed her the pencil. "Write your name." She stared at the paper like it was a trap. Then slowly she wrote. Rebecca. The lines were crooked but legible. Her fingers trembled. Samuel nodded. "Close enough." That became their ritual. Not lessons exactly. There were no chalkboards, no stern corrections, but shared moments. Samuel would carve out minutes between chores, handing her ledgers from the barn, maps of the land, notes on crop rotation. He'd grunt in approval or scratch a correction in the margin, and somehow those small gestures became the foundation of something deeper. It wasn't about education. Not really. It was about being handed something with the assumption that you could learn it, that you were worth the time. Rebecca studied everything he gave her. She memorized numbers, traced rows of figures at night by candlelight. Her hunger to understand was more than ambition. It was survival wrapped in hope. Because if she could master this world of cattle counts and supply lists, maybe, just maybe, she could prove she belonged somewhere. But still she never called him anything. No, sir. No pa, no name at all. She avoided it artfully, speaking only when necessary, directing comments into the air, into her hands, into the pages she'd filled with quiet effort. Every time the urge rose to say Samuel or Mr., it caught in her throat like a splinter. One morning she found a worn ledger left by her place at the table. A ribbon held it closed. Inside, the first page read in Martha's handwriting, "Write down what matters. Not just what you learn, what you feel too. No instructions, no rules, just a space that was now hers." That evening after dinner she wrote, "The calf was born early. Samuel showed me how to tie off the cord. He didn't flinch. I almost did, but I didn't. I think I did okay." The next night she added, "I can't tell if he's proud of me, but he lets me watch. That has to mean something." And later still, "Sometimes I want to ask him why he teaches me, but maybe I already know." Unspoken between them was a quiet ache. Samuel, the man who had once accepted a life without children, now found his evenings spent carving initials into wooden fence posts beside a girl who learned faster than he expected. A girl who never asked for affection, yet always hovered a little longer when he explained something. A girl who never called him father, but looked at him like she wanted to. And in his own way, he began to respond. He'd leave tools arranged for her before dawn. He'd wait an extra minute at the fence gate so they could walk together. He started speaking in we instead of I. One evening, while she was studying the crop log, Samuel leaned over her shoulder and tapped a figure she'd miscalculated. "Careful," he said. "That decimal makes the difference between gain and loss." She nodded, swallowing her embarrassment. Then he added more softly, "But that's what you're here for, ain't it? To learn it now so later, you won't have to guess." It wasn't a declaration, but it was enough. Enough to make her eyes sting. Enough to make her fingers grip the pencil tighter. Enough to make her write that night, "Maybe he's not teaching me to help him. Maybe he's teaching me to take over." And that thought alone lit a quiet fire inside her chest. one that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with. The stew was warm, the bread still soft from the oven. The table was simple, with just enough places set for three. Samuel sat in silence, slowly spooning his meal, while Rebecca kept her eyes on her plate, chewing like every bite might vanish if she waited too long. Then Martha stood, walked to the cupboard, and returned with something folded gently in her hands. A cloth napkin, delicately embroidered, faded around the edges but stitched with care. She laid it on Rebecca's lap without a word. Only when she returned to her seat did she speak, as if explaining to herself more than anyone else. "I made that years ago," she said, voice barely above the clink of dishes. "Back when I thought, well, back when I hoped there might be a little girl at this table someday." Rebecca didn't move, didn't speak. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, fingers gripping the napkin as if it might float away. She didn't understand why the room suddenly felt smaller, or why her eyes burned with something she didn't have a name for. No one said anything more. They just ate, slowly, quietly. But somewhere between the last spoonful and the creak of the chair as Martha rose to clear the plates, a tear slipped from Rebecca's cheek. It landed on the rim of her plate, not loud, but just loud enough for her to notice. That night, as she lay in the small room upstairs, the cloth napkin folded neatly on her dresser, she whispered a single word into the darkness. "Mom." Not loud, not brave, just enough for herself to hear, enough to see if it still hurt. Enough to wonder, maybe, just maybe, it didn't. It happened on a Tuesday, in the lull between the morning chores and the afternoon sun. The kind of quiet hour when the barn air turns thick and sleepy, and the dust floats like ghosts of yesterday's work. Rebecca was stacking feed sacks behind the stable when Jake, one of the newer ranch hands, wandered in. He was older, louder, always smiling just a little too wide. She had avoided him when she could, sensed something in the way his eyes lingered a second too long. This time, there was no one else around. He cornered her with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, reached out and said something she didn't fully hear. The sound of blood rushing in her ears drowned everything else. Then instinct took over. The cast iron skillet, left near the wood stove for lunch prep, was within reach. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She swung. The crack echoed through the barn like thunder on a clear day. Jake crumpled, groaning, more surprised than hurt. Rebecca stood frozen, the skillet still in her hands, her breath sharp and uneven. Samuel arrived first, drawn by the sound. He saw the scene, took it in with a single glance, then crouched beside Jake to check the damage. A bruised ego, a swollen temple, nothing fatal, just enough. Rebecca stood her ground. She didn't cry. She didn't explain. Martha arrived moments later, apron dusted with flour, hair pinned messily, eyes hard as flint. She looked from Jake to Rebecca to the skillet in her hands. Then calmly she said, "Did he touch you?" Rebecca nodded once. Martha didn't speak again. She turned to Jake, whose pride was still bleeding on the barn floor, and said, "Get your things, you're leaving, now." Samuel didn't argue. Later that evening, as the house returned to its usual rhythm, Rebecca waited for the punishment that never came. Instead, Martha placed a warm biscuit on her plate, sat beside her at the table and quietly said, "Next time, aim lower. The knees hurt longer." Rebecca blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Then Samuel added from across the room, "You did what you had to. You did right. No lecture, no shame, just affirmation." For the first time, the fear didn't linger. It didn't curdle in her stomach or settle behind her ribs. It passed, like a shadow that had finally been told it wasn't welcome here. That night she wrote in the ledger Martha had given her, "I didn't freeze. I didn't let it happen. And they believed me. They believed me." From that day forward, something shifted in her spine, an invisible straightening of years that had bent her low. The shadows stretched longer that evening, spilling over the porch like ink on old paper. Dinner was quiet. Rebecca pushed peas around her plate. Her appetite vanished into the silence that followed her all day. Samuel noticed it first, the way her eyes wouldn't meet theirs, the way she folded and refolded the same corner of her napkin. Martha, too, could feel the storm building behind her careful stillness. It was Martha who asked gently, "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" Rebecca hesitated. Then, in a voice too flat for a girl her age, she said, "There's something I haven't told you." They waited. "I used to work for someone," she said, not naming the man. "He ran things, dirty things in the city. He gave me food if I ran errands, if I didn't ask questions." Her voice didn't crack, but her hands trembled. "I left with one of his books. A ledger, names, deals. I thought if I had it, he'd leave me alone. But if he finds me, if they find me, you could be in danger." The words fell heavy between them. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Martha reached across the table, her fingers brushing the back of Rebecca's hand. "Why are you telling us now?" she asked softly. Rebecca took a shaky breath. "Because I don't want to leave. But I also don't want to stay if it'll hurt you." And there it was, the real fear, not danger, not revenge, but rejection. The fear that once again she'd be seen as too much to hold on to. Martha didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. Instead, she leaned closer and said, "You think this place is only home if you never cause us trouble." Rebecca said nothing. "Well," Martha continued, "then let me tell you something my own mother once told me. Home isn't the place where you avoid being a burden. It's the place where people choose to carry it with you." She reached out, gently cupping Rebecca's chin, lifting it just enough for their eyes to meet. "Baby," she whispered, "you didn't bring trouble here. You brought yourself. And we want you more than we fear any man from your past." Samuel finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. "We'll handle whatever comes. Just promise us one thing." Rebecca looked at him wary. "Next time you're scared, don't hide, don't run, tell us. Let us be what you never had." Tears slipped down her cheek before she realized they'd formed. She didn't sob, didn't speak. She just reached out, her hand resting on the edge of the table, closer to theirs than ever before. That night, in her ledger, she wrote, "Maybe being chosen isn't about being perfect. Maybe it's about being seen, known, and still being." The dust arrived before the horses did, thick clouds rolling down the dirt road, fast and furious, as if the land itself had remembered something it had tried to forget. Rebecca saw it from the window of the barn. She froze for only a second before stepping outside, shoulders square, jaw set, 3 riders, 1 wagon, and the man on the lead horse. She knew him, Garrett Mills. The name alone had once been enough to make her bones go cold. He taught her early that loyalty came at the price of silence. That food was never free. That girls who asked too many questions disappeared. Now, here he was again, spitting distance from the ranch that had made her feel safe. He dismounted slowly, all practiced charm and menace beneath his dusty coat. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "Thought I saw a ghost, but no, you're real, and you've got something of mine." Rebecca stood still. "I have nothing of yours." His smile dropped. "That ledger's mine, girl, and so are you." The last words scraped the air like rusted nails. She didn't flinch. By then, Samuel had stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled casually but loaded. Martha stood just behind him, arms crossed, her eyes steel. "This is our land," Samuel said firmly. "You're trespassing." Garrett didn't back down. "I'm just here to take what's mine. You can let the girl speak for herself." Rebecca stepped forward. "I will." The yard went silent. "I'm not yours," she said, voice steady. "I never was. I may have worked for you, but you never owned me. And that ledger, it's my insurance." He took a step forward. "You threatening me now?" "No," she said calmly. "I'm giving you an out. Take the book. Burn it if you want, just leave. And pretend I died on that road you left me on." That gave him pause. "I'll spread word," she added, "that Rebecca Sullivan's gone. The girl who had dirt on your deals is dead. You'll be safe, and I'll be free." Garrett looked her over like he didn't quite recognize the girl standing in front of him. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't begging. She was bargaining, and on her terms. He spit on the ground. "You better pray I never hear your name again." "Then don't go listening for it," she replied. She tossed the ledger into the dust. Garrett grabbed it, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The other riders followed. No gunfire, no screams, just the wind and then silence. Back inside, Samuel shut the door gently. "You sure about what you just did?" Rebecca nodded. "If I kept running, I'd never stop. And I'm tired of living like I'm one wrong step from being sent back to the dirt." Martha wrapped her arms around her before Rebecca could brace herself. Not out of pity, but pride. "You didn't just protect yourself," Martha whispered. "You protected this home." That night they ate in silence, but a different kind. One that wrapped around them like a quilt passed through generations. Later, alone in her room, Rebecca opened her ledger and wrote, "Today I wasn't a girl being hunted. I was a woman making a choice. I gave away the book, but I kept something more. I kept my name, my life, my place." And as the candle burned low, she knew Garrett might still tell stories about her, but none of them would matter, because the version of herself that mattered most now was the one she was becoming. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear, but out of something far stranger, relief, a kind of stillness she hadn't known since she was a child, the kind that comes not when danger disappears, but when you stop letting it lead you. She sat at her window, watching the wind play in the fields, listening to the soft hum of crickets that had returned like nothing had happened. And maybe, in a way, nothing had. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She thought back to the girl who once stood on an auction block, priced at $50, eyes empty, heart hidden. That girl had learned to read ledgers and livestock patterns not to prove her worth, but to build something she could stand on. She had listened more than she spoke until her silence became a strength. She had never once believed she would stay anywhere, and yet here she was. The next morning, Samuel handed her the ranch journal, his own thick, weathered book of names, sales, rainfall, and feed orders. On the inside cover, he had written only 3 words: "She belongs here." No signature, no explanation, just the truth. Rebecca pressed her fingers to the page. For once, she didn't doubt it. At breakfast, she poured coffee for Martha before being asked, folded napkins without looking. When Samuel asked about the west pasture, she answered with clarity and numbers. No hesitations, no shrinking. Later, when the ranch hands gathered by the barn, they nodded at her, not out of obligation but respect. She wasn't just the girl they took in. She was part of the system now, part of the story. And quietly, beneath it all, something else took root. A decision she hadn't named yet, but one that would guide the years to come. That she wouldn't just survive. The idea came not as a lightning bolt, but as a seed, planted in the quiet after the storm, when the earth was still damp with memory. Rebecca sat beneath the porch one evening, ledger in her lap, eyes tracing a column of expenses. But her thoughts were elsewhere, not on what they had lost, on what they could build. The children at the auction, their eyes, their silence, had never left her. She carried them like shadows, like echoes of who she had once been. And now, with the ledger closed and Garrett gone, a different thought began to take hold. What if this place could be more than a refuge? What if it could be a beginning? At supper, she looked up from her plate, voice steady. "I've been thinking," she said. Samuel glanced at her, chewing slowly. Martha waited. "We have space, we have hands, we know how to feed more than 3 mouths." They said nothing. She continued. "There are more children like I was out there. No names, no place, no voice." She looked from one to the other, something unshakable in her tone. "What if we brought them here? Not to work, to live, to learn, to be safe." Samuel leaned back in his chair. "You want to run an orphanage?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, I want to build a home, a real one, like you gave me, not charity, not saving, just choosing." Martha smiled first, slow and sure. "Well," she said, "I suppose we better sew more napkins." Samuel nodded, his approval quiet but full. "If anyone can lead that, it's you." They didn't speak as parents to child. They spoke as equals, as partners, as co-builders of something larger than any one story. That fall, the barn was cleared and repurposed. Cots were lined along its walls, quilts folded at the foot of each bed. Rebecca traveled with Samuel to nearby towns, speaking not like a girl from nowhere, but as a woman with purpose, a woman with a plan. By winter's end, they had taken in 6 children. By spring, 11. The ranch became more than land and cattle. It became a second chance wrapped in soft beds, warm bread, and quiet hands that didn't strike or shove. Rebecca walked the halls at night, checking each room, not because she didn't trust, but because she remembered what it was to wake alone in fear. And every child, no matter how broken, was greeted the same way. With a name, a meal, and someone waiting to listen. She never called herself Mama. That word was too sacred, too wounded. But the children began to call her that anyway. One boy, no more than 8, whispered it into her sleeve after falling asleep against her side. She didn't correct him. She only pulled the blanket higher. In her ledger, she wrote, "I never thought I'd be the one to give what I used to beg for. But here I am, holding small hands, telling bedtime stories, planting seeds in their hearts the way someone once did in mine." And when she closed the book, it was not with the finality of an ending, but the opening of a life she had chosen to live, not for herself alone, but for every soul still waiting to be called by name. Rebecca never said it aloud, but there was a shift in her footsteps after that night, a new rhythm in the way she crossed the yard, checked the stables, stirred the soup. Not hurried, not timid, certain. Confidence for her was never loud. It wasn't in raised voices or declarations. It was in the way she remembered every child's birthday, in the way she stitched initials into each quilt by hand. It was in the way she kept the fire lit in the dining room long after everyone else had gone to bed, just in case someone needed to talk, or cry, or simply sit in silence. She didn't lead with rules, she led with example. There was Anna, who flinched every time someone raised their voice, so Rebecca never raised hers. There was Eli, who hoarded food beneath his mattress, so she packed him an extra biscuit every morning with a quiet nod that said, "I see you. I understand." And there was Jonah, the oldest, who tried to run twice before finally breaking down beside the chicken coop and admitting he'd never been wanted anywhere. Rebecca sat with him on the cold ground for nearly an hour, not speaking. Then she handed him the ranch's supply list and said, "I need help planning next week's delivery. Think you're up for it?" He was. Children came with ghosts, with shattered rhythms, with hearts stitched loosely together by survival. Rebecca never tried to fix them. She simply made room for their pain, their anger, their confusion. She didn't promise they'd never be hurt again. She promised they wouldn't be alone next time. Samuel watched from a distance, marveling at the transformation of the girl who once refused to meet his eyes. Now, she was the one the children ran to when the thunder started, the one who reminded them that being strong didn't mean being silent. Martha, too, found herself stepping back, less out of age, more out of awe, watching Rebecca become what no one had ever given her: a safe place, a soft landing, a steady guide. And one night, after everyone was asleep, Martha found her at the table, ledger open, candle low. "You're still working?" she asked. Rebecca didn't look up. "Just writing things down so I don't forget." Martha pulled up a chair. "You know," she said, "there's more than one kind of motherhood." Rebecca smiled faintly, brushing a tear before it could fall. "I'm not sure I deserve that word." Martha reached across, touching her hand gently. "That's how I know you do." Outside, the wind moved through the fields like breath. Inside, the table held the weight of generations, of stories rewritten, of love redefined. Rebecca closed her ledger, not because the work was done, but because tomorrow would bring more. More mouths to feed, more wounds to soothe, more chances to whisper what she had once longed to hear: "You're safe now. You matter. You are loved." And for the first time, she didn't just believe it for herself. She believed she could give it too. It started as a quiet understanding, one that didn't need announcing, didn't need a moment. Just a slow unfolding like dawn across the field she had come to call home. Over time, the questions came. Neighbors, church ladies, old ranchers with more opinions than cattle. Such a fine young woman, no plans to settle down. Pretty girl like you, don't you want children of your own? Rebecca always smiled, never sharp but always steady. I have more children than I can count, she'd say softly, and each one has chosen to stay. And that was the truth. She never wore a wedding ring. She never entertained suitors. Not because love frightened her, but because she had found her love poured into 100 small hands and wild hearts. It was not romantic. It was not conventional. But it was hers, and it was enough. She watched them grow, these children who came with bruised hearts and broken rhythms. One had nightmares so fierce he wouldn't sleep unless his hand touched the edge of her rocking chair. Another refused to speak for months, until one spring morning when he asked if he could plant a tree in memory of his mother. Rebecca let him dig with his bare hands. Every child brought a different ache, a different lesson. Some stayed for years, some only for a season, but each one carried her story forward. She kept a box, worn and wooden, tucked beneath her bed. Inside were letters, drawings, tiny tokens. A beaded bracelet from Anna, a bent horseshoe from Jonah, a folded note that read, "Thank you for not asking me why I cried every night, just for being there. No name, just truth." Each child changed her. Not in grand ways, but in the quiet undoing of the loneliness she had once believed permanent. And in them, she saw pieces of herself. She saw the girl who once flinched when footsteps approached. The girl who whispered "Mom" to the dark and waited for it to echo. The girl who thought she'd never be enough for anyone to stay. Now, she was the one staying. She was the one being called for in the night, the one whose hands tucked blankets and braided hair and wiped dirt from scraped knees. The one who didn't have answers for everything, but knew how to wait, how to listen, how to hold space. The ranch changed too. What was once land and fences became community. Former children returned as adults, some with families of their own, some with nothing but a suitcase and the need to remember they were once loved here. Rebecca never turned anyone away. She built more rooms, bought more books, planted more trees. And one day, while repairing a gate with her sleeves rolled high, a young woman named Clara, one of the first girls to arrive years ago, said softly, "You know, you raised me." Rebecca looked up, brushing hair from her eyes. Clara continued, "You didn't have to, but you did. You chose to." Rebecca smiled, "And I'd choose you again." That night, in the quiet of her room, she lit a candle and opened her ledger. She wrote, "They say motherhood begins with birth, but I've learned it begins the moment you decide not to walk away. The moment you sit down beside someone and say, 'I'll stay,' even when it's hard, even when you push, even when you don't believe you deserve it. That's where mothering begins." She closed the book. Outside, the wind hummed low and kind, and in the barn a baby goat cried for its mother, who came without question. Rebecca smiled. She hadn't given life to a single child, but she had given them something else. A home, a heart, a place to begin again. Some days, Rebecca would sit beneath the willow tree near the fence line. Its branches bowed low like arms reaching to shelter. She'd bring her tea, still steaming, and a worn notebook filled with names. Not numbers, not expenses, just names. She'd read through them slowly like a prayer. Clara, Jonah, Eli, Miriam, Daniel, Lacey. Each name a life once tangled in fear, now woven into the story of this land. And with each one, a memory surfaced. First laughs, first words, the way some of them still called her Becca while others simply called her home. She never expected to find herself in motherhood, and she certainly never imagined it without a cradle, without lullabies sung to infants who shared her blood. But her arms had held grief just as surely. Her voice had calmed panic in the dead of night. Her hands had taught dozens of children how to tie their boots, clean a wound, harvest tomatoes. She had become their constant, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Every single day. In the stillness of the early morning or in the soft quiet after a meal, Rebecca sometimes caught her reflection in the window. She didn't see a savior. She didn't see a martyr. She saw a woman with weathered hands, a lined face, and eyes softer than they used to be. Time had not spared her, but it had shaped her gently, like river stone worn smooth by years of carrying the current for others. When asked by travelers or curious visitors, "Don't you ever regret not having your own children?" She'd just smile, never defensive. "I do have children," she'd say. "They just didn't come from me. They came to me." And that difference to her was sacred. Over the years, some of the children would drift away, seeking cities or futures that pulled them far beyond the ranch. But many wrote, many called. Some returned every season, bringing their own children to meet the woman who raised me right. Rebecca never asked for those gestures, but she welcomed them like rain after drought. It was near dusk when the question came, quiet, almost lost in the sound of spoons scraping stew bowls and boots settling by the hearth. The children were gathered after supper, bellies full, stories half told. That soft hour when the weight of the day loosens, and the world seems safer somehow. 8-year-old Lily, her braids still damp from bathwater, climbed into Rebecca's lap without asking. She leaned her head against Rebecca's shoulder, then turned to look at her with wide, searching eyes. "Mama," she asked, "was I ever sold like Miss Rebecca was?" The room fell still. No one gasped, no one scolded. Rebecca's heart clenched, not from shame, but from recognition. That tone wasn't one of accusation. It was the quiet voice of a child trying to make sense of where she came from. She didn't rush to answer. She stroked Lily's braid, took a breath, and said, "Yes, sweetheart, I was." Lily blinked up at her. "And me?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "Maybe not with a sign around your neck or coins in someone's hand. But yes, in ways that weren't fair, in ways that said you didn't matter." The silence in the room didn't tighten, it softened. "But," Rebecca added, her voice strong but gentle, "that's not who you are, and it's not who I am either. What happened to us was real, but it doesn't get to decide what happens next." Lily thought for a moment. "So, I'm not broken." Rebecca smiled, tears forming. "No, baby, you're not broken. You're just a garden someone forgot to water, but you're growing now. You're growing strong." Around them, the children listened, not for gossip, not for drama, but for a map. for a way out of their own unspoken pasts. Rebecca didn't offer platitudes. She offered proof, her life, their lives, this ranch. A living, breathing answer to a question too big for one night. She hugged Lily close. "You're loved now, you're safe now. And no one, gets to put a price on you ever again." That night a few more children asked quiet questions in the hallway. Rebecca answered each with honesty, never fear. Because when a child asks, "Was I worth so little?" The drought came without warning. No clouds, no mercy. The land cracked beneath their feet, crops withered to dust, and the well that once sang through the summer now echoed with silence. Rebecca stood at the edge of the field, boots buried in brittle soil, heart heavier than the sky. She'd known loss before, but this felt different. It wasn't one child. It was all of them. It was their food, their shelter, their chance at a life untouched by fear. She ran her fingers along the old wooden fence, watching the horizon burn gold, and wondered, not aloud, but deep inside, had she come this far only to lose it all? Inside the house, ledgers didn't lie. The figures no longer added up. Feed was low, supplies thinner. The letters she'd written for help had gone unanswered, and still children laughed somewhere in the yard. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table that night, head in her hands, ledger unopened beside her. Martha placed a cup of tea in front of her, said nothing, only squeezed her shoulder. The next morning, before sunrise, she stepped outside to the sound of hammers, buckets, voices. The children were already working. Jonah was leading a group reinforcing the fence so the few remaining cattle wouldn't stray. Lily and two others had gathered scraps from the barn, weaving makeshift sunshades for the garden beds. Clara, now grown and back to help, met Rebecca's stunned gaze. "You kept us alive when we had nothing. Let us return the favor." Rebecca tried to protest, but the well. "We can carry water from the river. It's 5 miles. We'll take turns." "And the crops. We planted root vegetables, less thirsty than corn. They won't grow fast enough." Clara smiled. "We're not trying to grow crops, Mama. We're trying to grow hope, and you taught us how." Something in Rebecca cracked, not from despair but from awe. She had prepared them for storms, for hunger, for grief. But she hadn't expected this. That one day they would be the ones holding her up. That evening the kitchen buzzed with tired footsteps and quiet pride. Clothes dusty, hands blistered, but eyes bright. They sang as they cooked, off-key, loud. Beautiful. Rebecca didn't stop them. She didn't interrupt with fear or reality. She simply whispered to Martha, "I thought I built this for them." Martha smiled. "Turns out they built it for all of us." In her notebook that night, Rebecca wrote, "We didn't survive because the well held. We survived because when the ground broke open, we chose to hold each other tighter. We survived because they remembered what it felt like to be carried, and now they carry." Outside, the rain still hadn't come, but inside, not a single heart had gone dry. That night, after the lamps were dimmed and the last dish dried, Rebecca stepped outside. The porch creaked beneath her feet as it always had, but the quiet felt different, full, not empty. A kind of hush that comes only after everyone has given everything they had, and then a little more. She looked up at the sky, cloudless, unyielding. But for the first time in days, it didn't feel cruel, just distant, like something that might eventually return. Behind her, soft footsteps. It was Jonah. He didn't say much. He never had. But he stood beside her the way a son stands beside someone who raised him without needing to say the word. Rebecca broke the silence. "I was ready to give up," she admitted. Jonah didn't flinch. "Yeah, we knew." She turned to him, surprised. He shrugged. "We know that look. We used to wear it too." There was no blame in his voice, just understanding. Rebecca exhaled, her breath catching on something between guilt and gratitude. "And you still stayed." Jonah looked out across the dark field. "You didn't leave us when we were half broken and hard to love. Why would we leave you when you're just tired?" She couldn't respond, not with words. So instead she reached for his hand, calloused and sun-warmed, and held it for a moment, just long enough to let the silence say what both of them already knew. Later that week, it did rain. Not a storm, not salvation. Just a soft, soaking drizzle that darkened the earth and made the children run barefoot across the yard, laughing like it was Christmas. Rebecca stood at the threshold and watched them, splashing, slipping, arms wide to the sky. She didn't join them, she didn't need to, because this was the harvest she had sown, not the vegetables, not the animals, but the resilience, the love, the unshakable truth that even when water ran out, love didn't. She closed her eyes and let the sound of laughter and rain blend together, like a lullaby only the land could sing. 25 years. Rebecca sat on the porch, the same creaking wood beneath her feet, the same horizon stretching wide and golden before her. But everything else had changed. The barn had been rebuilt twice, the house repainted. The apple trees now arched with fruit. And the children, more than 60, had come and gone through this land, each one leaving behind a mark. Initials carved on the old swing post, mismatched quilts folded in the attic, faded drawings still taped inside the pantry door. Some had returned as teachers, others as parents themselves, bringing sons and daughters to see the place where their own story began. Rebecca never called herself founder or matron or mother. But every time one of them turned to her, voice breaking, eyes wide, and whispered "Mama," she felt it like a benediction. A soft crown laid gently on her graying head. She never needed a statue, never needed her name carved in wood. She only needed to know they had chosen better for themselves, and that in choosing they had become free. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, one child tugged at her sleeve. A girl with wild curls and dirt on her knees. "Can I stay?" she asked. Rebecca smiled, heart full, voice quiet. "You already have." In the scorching heat of Texas, 1887, a teenage girl was sold at a child labor auction for $50. No name, no history, just a price. The man who bought her, a lonely, infertile rancher named Samuel McKinnon, desperate to save his dying ranch, but even more desperate to fill a silence that no cattle, no land, and no time had been able to fix. He thought he was buying help. What he didn't know was that he'd just invited home the one person who would change everything. His land, his marriage, his purpose, and most of all, his heart. This isn't a story about rescue. It's a story about healing, about a girl who had every reason to close herself off, and a man who had forgotten how to hope. Together, they would prove that family isn't always born. It's chosen, grown, and sometimes found in the most unlikely places. So stay with us, because by the end of this story, you might just believe in second chances too. Comment below which moment in the story touched you the most. And if you love this kind of storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. Bye-bye, see you.